The Great Plague of London, 1665 to 66, one of the final major epidemics of the bubonic plague to hit England, taking out an estimated 100,000 people, almost a quarter of the population of London at the time. The outbreak began in the poor and densely populated parish of St. Giles in the Fields, before spreading rapidly throughout the city. It was part of the larger pandemic that affected various parts of Europe, caused by Yersinia pestis, the bacterium associated with other plague outbreaks, including the infamous Black Death. The city's response included quarantine measures, the killing of stray animals, and the use of plague doctors who treated victims with often dubious methods. The plague dwindled during the winter of 1666, due in part to the Great Fire of London, which inadvertently helped end the outbreak by destroying many of the overcrowded, rat-infested urban slums that had allowed the disease to thrive in the first place. Hello and welcome to the channel. If it's your first time here, it's good to meet you, and if you're coming back, good to have you with me again. Well, if you'd like to support the channel, you're already doing it. If you want to go above and beyond, you may refer to the description of the video. Now, I'm sure you have seen my previous video on the Black Death. If you would like to go and watch that, you'll find it in the medieval playlist. If not, let's continue, get nice and comfortable, as we talk about the Great Plague of London. Let's set the scene first. In the 17th century, London, like many European cities, was frequently afflicted by the plague. The disease had claimed around 30,000 lives in 1603, 35,000 in 1625, and 10,000 in 1636, with additional outbreaks causing further deaths in other years. It was a normal part of life, an unpleasant one, but an experience quintessential to being in medieval times. By late 664, the appearance of a bright comet had stirred fear among the populace of London, leading to widespread speculation about impending calamities. The city itself was densely packed into about 448 acres, encircled by ancient walls designed originally to fend off raiders and bordered to the south by the mighty River Thames. Key entry points through the city wall included the gates at Ludgate, Newgate, Aldersgate, Cripplegate, Moorgate, Bishopsgate, and Aldgate, while the Thames could be crossed via the London Bridge. Of course, sanitary conditions one would expect in the poorer districts were deplorable, to say the least. Overcrowded tenements and garrets made cleanliness completely unattainable. Streets lacked sanitation, with open drains carrying filth along their lengths. The streets, muddied and littered with animal droppings, household waste, and sewage, presented a dire public health hazard. During the summer, the refuse, of course, attracted swarms of flies, and in the winter, the streets were awash with human waste. To mitigate the worst of this pollution, the city corporation employed rakers who would clear the filth and transported to heaps outside the city walls, where it would, of course, continue to decompose, contributing to the pervasive, overpowering stench, certainly always downwind of that. Many residents resorted to carrying handkerchiefs or nosegays to cover their nostrils, often stuffed with a few flowers to try and ease the stench. Transportation, of course, within the city was chaotic and congested, a very grim situation. While some goods like coal arrived by barge down the Thames, most supplies and traffic moved via the congested and dirty roads, and of course they moved by horses. And the more horses, well, you know. The city's gateways created bottlenecks as well, severely hampering movement, and the 19-arch London Bridge was notorious for its overcrowding. Affluent individuals often travelled in hackney carriages or sedan chairs to avoid the filth, while the less fortunate walked and risked being splashed with dirty water from the roads, slops discarded from the second stories of homes, or runoff from roofs, or perhaps even worse things being thrown out from chamber pots. Adding to the urban miasma was the choking black smoke emitted from the many factories, breweries, iron smelters, and the coal burned in approximately 15,000 dank and dingy homes. During the 17th century, London's rapid expansion pushed its boundaries beyond those ancient city walls, leading to the emergence of densely populated shanty towns. These makeshift neighborhoods, largely devoid of sanitation, were hastily constructed to accommodate the influx of artisans and tradespeople drawn to the bustling city. Despite government efforts to restrict their growth, these suburbs housed over 250,000 people. The political turmoil of the Commonwealth era saw many loyalists fleeing Britain, leaving behind numerous townhouses. These buildings were quickly occupied by newcomers, who transformed them into overcrowded tenements, where multiple families shared single rooms, leading to dilapidated conditions and rampant rat infestations. The City of London was managed by the Lord Mayor, Aldermen, and Common Councillors, but its authority did not extend to the entire metropolitan area. Surrounding the walled city were districts known as liberties, self-governing areas often linked historically to religious institutions dissolved during the earlier dissolution of the monasteries. Their secular successors retained these governance rights. By 1665, these liberties formed a protective ring known as the City and Liberties, encompassing the immediate outskirts of London. However, beyond this area lay further suburbs with their own local governance. Westminster, for example, had developed into an independent town with its own set of liberties, seamlessly connected to London through urban sprawl. Similarly, the Tower of London operated independently. Areas outside these specific jurisdictions fell under the counties of Middlesex or Surrey, depending on their location relative to the River Thames. At the time, The bubonic plague, a feared scourge, was rampant, though its origins and transmissions were mysteries still wrapped in great many layers of medieval superstition. In fact, many attributed the plague to noxious vapors from the earth, that old miasma theory, strange weather, or even unusual animal behavior. It was not until the late 19th century that Alexandre Yersin pinpointed Yersinia pestis as the bacterial culprit, with rat fleas identified as the primary vector. The definitive link between Yersinia pestis and the Great Plague of London was only established through DNA analysis in 2016, suggesting that human bodily lice may have played more significant roles in spreading the plague than previously thought. Well, to assess the impact of an epidemic accurately, it's crucial to understand the population size at risk. I mean, it's all relative. The numbers are only relative to percentages, don't you think? In the 17th century, London lacked an official census, leaving estimates based on the work of pioneering demographer John Graunt, who lived from 1620 to 74. A fellow of the Royal Society, Graunt applied a scientific approach to demographic statistics. In 1662, he estimated London's population, encompassing the City of London, the Liberties, Westminster, and the out parishes, at approximately 384,000. This figure was derived from weekly published bills of mortality, kind of like the obituaries. By 1665, Graunt revised this estimate upwards to 460,000, though other contemporaries speculated higher numbers, such as the French ambassador who suggested 600,000, though these higher estimates lacked empirical support. In this era, there was no legal obligation to report deaths to the authorities. Instead, each parish designated 2 or more searchers of the dead, as they were called in official title, tasked with inspecting corpses to determine the cause of death. Searchers, often destitute elderly women reliant on the parish for support, charged families a small fee for each death that was reported. Their role was complicated by their frequent illiteracy and limited medical knowledge, which, paired with potential dishonesty, could skew mortality data. Typically notified by local sextons or the tolling of church bells, these searchers were excluded from official records if deaths were not reported to a church, as was often the case with non-Anglicans or Jews. During plague outbreaks, searchers were required to isolate themselves, carrying a white stick when outdoors to signal their role and avoid contact with the general population to prevent disease spread. They reported their findings to the parish clerk, who then relayed the information to the company of parish clerks, the Lord Mayor, and, when the plague became a matter of more national concern, the Minister of the State. This data informed the bills of mortality, which listed weekly death totals by parish, including deaths attributed to the plague. John Graunt criticized the searchers' frequent misidentification of diseases, noting their propensity to report deaths as due to consumption rather than other recognized diseases. He observed that the promise of a cup of ale and a doubled fee could persuade a searcher to alter death records to suit a household's preference, particularly to avoid the stigma of the plague. As the plague intensified, the government implemented a quarantine system, sealing affected houses for 40 days, a measure that often resulted in additional deaths of inhabitants from neglect. Houses with plague victims were marked with a red cross, and the words, "Lord have mercy on us," with a watchman posted outside. Although official records cited 68,596 plague deaths, Grant suggested that the actual numbers could exceed official accounts by at least 30,000, indicating significant underreporting and the system's limitations in capturing the epidemic's true scale. The system of using searchers to report causes of death continued until 1836, reflecting long-standing practices in managing public health data. As reports of plague circulated through Europe in the 1660s, England had become increasingly concerned about the potential for the disease to spread across its borders. The Privy Council, recognizing the threat posed by international trade and travel, revisited historical quarantine measures that, in the past, had proven to be somewhat effective. By November 1663, following reports of plague in Amsterdam and Hamburg, the Council reinstated quarantine protocols for ships that were arriving in London. 2 naval vessels were tasked with patrolling the Thames estuary to intercept any incoming ships. Those coming from ports known to be infected were required to anchor at Hole Haven on Canvey Island and undergo a Trentine, a 30-day isolation period. Only after this period could these ships proceed upriver. To ensure compliance, ships that completed their isolation or originated from ports not affected by the plague were issued with a certificate of health, allowing them to continue their journey. Additionally, a secondary inspection line was established between the forts at Tilbury on the north bank and Gravesend on the south bank of the Thames. This line served to check and pass only those ships carrying the necessary health certification. As the situation on the continent deteriorated, the quarantine period was extended in May 1664 from 30 days to 40 days. The geographical scope of the quarantine was also expanded to include ships arriving from Holland, Zeeland, and Friesland, regions within the Dutch Republic that were heavily impacted by the plague. Conversely, restrictions on ships from Hamburg were lifted in November of that year as the situation in that area improved somewhat. Starting in May, quarantine measures were similarly implemented in 29 other British ports, beginning with Great Yarmouth. These measures, though critical for public health, sparked diplomatic tensions, particularly with the Dutch Republic. The Dutch ambassador protested these severe constraints placed on trade. However, England maintained that his actions were justified and necessary, noting that it had been one of the last countries to impose such strict measures. The enforcement of these regulations was rigorous. Any individual or household found to have allowed voyagers to come ashore without completing the mandatory quarantine was themselves subjected to a 40-day quarantine. This strict adherence to quarantine protocols shows the seriousness with which England approached the threat of the plague, prioritizing public health over the inconveniences to trade and international relations. The regular publication of the aforementioned bills of mortality had already begun in 1603, the year which recorded that staggering death toll of 33,000 deaths due to the plague. From then until 1665, there were only 4 years without any recorded cases of the plague at all. The severity of the situation was highlighted in various years. 1563 witnessed 1,000 deaths weekly in London. 1593 saw 15,000 deaths. 1625, a particularly devastating outbreak with 41,000 deaths, which was referred to at the time as the Great Plague, until the even more severe epidemic that we find ourselves speaking of now in 1665. Also, between 1640 and 46, there were 11,000 deaths, peaking in 1647 with a total of 3,597. These figures, while officially recorded, are generally considered underestimations of the actual death tolls. Now, plague was sufficiently rare that many medicinal practitioners of the time might have never encountered it firsthand. The medical community was of course diverse, ranging from university-educated physicians to apothecaries who often took on medical roles, to outright charlatans. It was fairly easy to fake a degree back then. This varied medical expertise, combined with other prevalent diseases such as smallpox outbreak the previous year, complicated the accurate diagnosis and understanding of the epidemic's beginnings. Reports from the winter of 1664 to 65 noted several cases of the plague, some fatal and others less severe, suggesting the initial occurrences of the disease. And that winter was particularly harsh, with prolonged periods of frost from December to March, and the Thames freezing over twice, conditions that likely slowed the spread of the disease. The 1665 plague is believed to have been introduced to England from the Netherlands originally, where the disease had been occurring sporadically since 1599. It is suspected that the initial contagion arrived via Dutch trading ships carrying cotton from Amsterdam, which suffered a severe outbreak in 1663, resulting in approximately 50,000 deaths. The first English areas to be affected were likely the dockside districts and the parish of St. Giles in London, areas characterized by high densities of poor workers living in substandard, slum-like conditions. In St. Giles, 2 deaths in 1664 and 1 in February of 1665 were noted but not officially recorded as plague-related. Thus, no immediate action was taken. However, by the first 4 months of 1665, the overall mortality in London began to climb, and climb significantly. By the end of April 1665, official records indicated only 4 plague deaths, 2 of which were in St. Giles. Yet, interestingly, the total weekly death toll had risen from about 290 to 398. Something was definitely not adding up. Well, despite just 3 official cases of plague in April, a number that in previous years would not have prompted significant action, the Privy Council now chose to implement household quarantines. Middlesex justices of the peace were directed to inspect suspected cases and enforce quarantine measures on confirmed ones. Similar directives were soon extended to the City and Liberties by the King's Bench. The enforcement of these measures led to unrest in St. Giles, where the community reacted violently to the sealing of the first house. A riot ensued. The door was broken down, and the quarantined inhabitants were freed. Well, the rioters, of course, faced harsh penalties for this. Additionally, instructions were issued to construct pest houses, isolated hospitals intended to treat or contain the sick. This swift government response, despite the initially low number of recorded cases, indicated a recognition of the outbreak's potential severity. I'm sure you're thinking by now how history repeats itself. Isn't it funny how in medieval times they were doing all of this? Well, as spring warmed into summer, the plague began to grip London more tightly. In the week spanning May 2nd to May the 9th, the parish of St. Giles recorded 3 deaths, with nearby St. Clement Danes reporting 4, and 1 death each in St. Andrew Holborn and St. Mary Woolchurch Hall, the latter being the only case recorded within the city walls at the time. The growing concern prompted the Privy Council to form a committee dedicated to exploring effective plague prevention strategies. As part of their initial measures, they decided to close several alehouses in the affected districts and impose restrictions on the number of lodgers per household to prevent overcrowding. In response to the escalating situation, the Lord Mayor of London issued a proclamation mandating that all householders were responsible for keeping the streets outside their homes clean, a duty traditionally upheld by the homeowners themselves rather than the city authorities, who employed scavengers and rakers to manage only the most severe refuse issues. As the situation deteriorated, city aldermen were tasked with identifying and penalizing those who neglected this responsibility. The situation in St. Giles, where cases were particularly rising, led to more drastic measures. The area was effectively quarantined, with constables given orders to scrutinize anybody who was attempting to leave. They were to detain vagrants and anyone they suspected of carrying the plague. This period of increasing dread is captured vividly in the diaries of Samuel Pepys, a senior Admiralty official. His entries provide a crucial eyewitness to the account of the plague's impact, and on April 30th of that year, 1665, he noted the palpable fear gripping the city, writing, "Great fears of the sickness here in the city, it being said that 2 or 3 houses are already shut up. God preserve us all." Another significant literary source that offers insights into this grim period is Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, published almost 50 years after the event in 1722. And although Defoe was only 5 years old at the time, his narrative was enriched by the personal experience of his family members and interviews with survivors. But here is one account from a Puritan minister who was there witnessing all of this. His name was Thomas Vincent, and this is what he had wrote. It was in the month of May that the plague at first was taken notice of. Our bill of mortality did let us know but of 3 which died of the disease in the whole year before. But in the beginning of May, the bill tells us of 9. Fear quickly begins to creep upon people's hearts. Great thoughts and discourse there is in town about the plague, and they cast it in their minds whether they should go if the plague should increase. Yet, when the next week's bill signifieth to them the disease from 9 to 3, their minds are something appeased. Discourse of that subject cools, fears are hushed, and hopes take place. That the black cloud did but threaten, and give a few drops, but the wind would drive it away. But when in the next bill the number of the dead by the plague is mounted from 3 to 14, and in the next to 17, and in the next to 43, the disease begins so much to increase and disperse. Now, secure sinners begin to be startled, and those who would have slept at quiet still in their nests are unwillingly awakened. End of the account from Thomas Vincent. By July 1665, the plague had engulfed the entire city of London, causing widespread panic and chaos. The affluent, including King Charles II, his family and his court, of course, hastily vacated the city. Initially retreating to Salisbury, they relocated to Oxford in September following reports of plague cases in Salisbury. In stark contrast, many of the city's officials, including the alderman and the Lord Mayor Sir John Lawrence, chose to voluntarily remain at their posts, facing the epidemic head-on. Credit where it's due, of course. The mass exodus of the wealthy was vividly described by Daniel Defoe in later times, who recounted scenes of carts and wagons laden with goods and families, coaches filled with the gentry and horsemen in tow, all rushing away from the plague-stricken city. As businesses shuttered with the departure of merchants and professionals, the city's economic life sharply declined. But hey, with all those rich people fleeing the city, I'm sure there was opportunities for individuals to procure riches through other methods. While the crisis was further compounded by the departure of key health and spiritual leaders, Defoe lamented the absence of a significant number of clergymen, physicians, and apothecaries, who were crucial in managing the escalating crisis. However, it was of course not just the affluent who sought refuge. The poorer residents, too, were equally as terrified, and many attempted to flee. Yet, unlike the wealthy, the poorer faced considerable obstacles in leaving. The city authorities required anyone leaving to possess a health certificate signed by the Lord Mayor, which grew increasingly difficult to secure as the epidemic worsened. course, the rich always have their way of procuring certificates, but the impoverished had little choice but to leave behind their homes and means of livelihood, facing an uncertain future. As the summer progressed and the death toll rose, the situation became dire for these refugees. Villagers outside of London, initially receptive, began to resist the influx of displaced city dwellers, fearing the spread of the contagion. With or without health certificates, these individuals were often turned away at village boundaries, forced to avoid towns, and traverse the countryside. Lacking shelter or resources, many resorted to scavenging and theft to survive. Tragically, numerous refugees perished under harsh conditions of starvation and dehydration during the exceptionally hot summer, their fates marked by desperation and sorrow. Definitely backed into a corner, weren't they? Feel sorry for them. Well, by the end of July 1665, the plague had reached catastrophic levels in London. The weekly bill of mortality recorded a staggering 3,014 deaths, with 2,020 of them attributed to the plague, although these figures likely underrepresent the actual death toll. In comparison, deaths in other years during the same period typically totaled around 300, so this was pretty much 10 times as worse. As the epidemic escalated, London's traditional burial grounds were of course quickly overflowed, prompting the grim necessity for mass graves. Cart drivers roamed the streets with the chilling call of "Bring out your dead," collecting bodies to be dumped in communal pits. The sheer volume of deaths overwhelmed the city's capacity to manage the crisis discreetly. Initially, authorities mandated that the removal and burial of bodies occur only at night to prevent public panic. However, the death toll soon outpaced the availability of cart drivers, leading to corpses piling up against house walls. Necessity forced a return to daytime collection, and the burial pits swelled with decomposing bodies. In the parish of Aldgate, workers dug a massive grave near the churchyard, 50 feet long and 20 feet wide. This process continued, with laborers digging at one end while bodies were dumped at the other. Eventually, the pit was extended downwards until it reached groundwater at 20 feet, ultimately containing 1,114 corpses. The streets were haunted by plague doctors, many lacking any formal medical training, who attempted to diagnose and treat the afflicted the best way they could. Despite organized efforts by city officials who hired physicians and structured burial operations, the rapid spread of the disease fueled widespread panic. Misunderstandings about the plague's transmission led to drastic measures. The city corporation ordered the killing of countless dogs and cats, mistakenly believing that they might carry the disease. This action inadvertently may have prolonged the outbreak by reducing the natural predators of rats that carried the plague-bearing fleas. Authorities also advocated for environmental remedies based on the miasma theory, which posited that bad air spread the disease. Well, giant bonfires were lit in the streets, and residents were instructed to keep their home fires burning continuously in the hopes of purifying the air. Additionally, tobacco was widely believed to be a preventative measure against the plague, leading to the anecdotal observation that no tobacconist in London had succumbed to the disease during the outbreak. As the plague continued to ravage London, the city's economic and social structures nearly collapsed. Samuel Pepys, in his detailed diary entries, captured the desolation of the city thusly: "Lord, how empty the streets are, and how melancholy! So many poor sick people in the streets full of sores. In Westminster there is never a physician, and but one apothecary left, all being dead." This account reflects the dire circumstances as the once bustling streets of London were left deserted, save for the dead carts collecting the bodies and the few dying victims visible on the streets. Despite the chaos, starvation was largely averted, thanks to proactive measures taken by Sir John Lawrence and the Corporation of London. They implemented a policy whereby a commission of 1 farthing was added to the price of every quarter of corn landed at the Port of London. This slight increase in grain prices ensured a steady supply and helped sustain the population during the epidemic. Furthermore, the surrounding villages, cut off from their usual markets in the capital, adapted by leaving vegetables at designated market areas on the outskirts of the city. Transactions were conducted from a distance with vendors, shouting prices to avoid direct contact, and payments were made by leaving coins in buckets of vinegar, believed to be a disinfectant. The recorded death toll, as per official sources, escalated over the summer months, rising from around 2,000 deaths per week to over 7,000 deaths per week by September. But of course, the figures likely fall short of the actual numbers affected by the plague. The reliability of these records was compromised by the high mortality rate among sextons and parish clerks responsible for maintaining them. Additionally, certain communities like the Quakers did not cooperate with official record keeping, and many of the city's poorest residents were just thrown into mass graves without any formal record of their deaths. The scale of the epidemic is further obscured by the fact that only deaths were documented, with no records of those who contracted the plague and recovered. Moreover, the subsequent Great Fire of London in 1066 destroyed many of the remaining records. In those few districts where records were preserved, documented plague deaths range from 30% to over 50% of the population, indicating the devastating impact of the disease where it was most intensely felt. Well, we have another passage from Thomas Vincent, yes, the one aforementioned. It goes like this. It was very dismal to behold the red crosses, and read in great letters, "Lord, have mercy upon us," on the doors, and the watchmen standing before them with halberds, people passing by them so gingerly, and with such fearful looks as if they had been lined with the enemies in ambush to destroy them. A man at the corner of Artillery Wall, that as I judged through the dizziness of his head with the disease, which seized upon him there, had dashed his face against the wall, and when I came by, he lay hanging with his body face over the rails, and bleeding upon the ground, and when I spoke to him, he could make no answer, but rattled in the throat, and, as I was informed, within half an hour, died in that place. It would be endless to speak of what we have seen and heard, of some in their frenzy rising out of their beds and leaping about their rooms, others crying and roaring at their windows, some coming forth almost naked and running into the streets. Scarcely a day passed over my head for, I think, a month or more together, but I should hear of the death of some one or more that I knew. The first day that they were smitten, the next day some hopes of recovery, and the third day they were dead. The 1665 plague outbreak, while the most devastating in London, also left its mark on various other regions of England. One of the most poignant episodes occurred in the village of Eyam in Derbyshire. It is believed that the plague was introduced to Eyam by a merchant who received a parcel of cloth from London, unknowingly contaminated with the disease. Realizing the potential danger, the villagers of Eyam took the extraordinary step of self-imposing a quarantine to prevent the spread of the plague to neighboring areas. This act of self-sacrifice had dire consequences. Approximately a third of Eyam's population succumbed to the disease over the next 14 months. The plague also significantly impacted other regions, including Derby and Norwich, which experienced severe outbreaks. In contrast, the city of Bristol managed to mitigate the worst effects of the plague through diligent efforts by its city council. During the outbreak from April to September of 1666, Bristol maintained a relatively low death rate of about 0.6%. That's pretty good. This was a remarkable achievement given the rampant spread of the plague in many other cities during the same period. These varied responses highlight the different strategies and levels of success in managing the public health crisis. The story of Eyam in particular remains a testament to the extraordinary measures that some communities took to try to halt the spread of this devastating epidemic. Well, by the late autumn of 1665, the death toll from the plague in London had begun to wane, leading to February 1666, when it was deemed safe enough for King Charles II and his court to return to the city. This return sparked a resurgence of life in London. The gentry arrived in carriages, loaded with their possessions, and key societal functions resumed. Judges returned to Windsor to convene in Westminster Hall, and Parliament, adjourned since April of the previous year, finally reconvened in September of 1666. The city's streets and marketplaces, once emptied by the plague, once again buzzed with activity as trade rejuvenated and businesses finally reopened. London once again became a beacon for those seeking opportunity, leading Lord Clarendon to remark in March of 1666 on the city's restored vibrancy. While the plague's intensity had diminished, sporadic cases did persist into the mid-1666. The Great Fire of London, however, in September of that year, which devastated much of the city of London, was actually believed by some contemporaries to have helped extinguish the epidemic. I mean, you can't die from plague if you've died from the fire, right? Good logic. However, historical analysis, in hindsight, suggests the plague had largely receded before the fire occurred, with most post-fire plague cases reported in the suburbs and not the fire-ravaged city centre. Official records, like the bills of mortality, logged 68,596 plague deaths in London for 1665, though Lord Clarendon estimated the number could be double that. The countrywide death toll for the plague in that same year and the following year, 1666, was estimated by Dr. Thomas Gumble to be around 200,000. Thus, the plague of 1665 to 66 marked the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in Great Britain, with the last recorded plague death occurring around 1679. In terms of demographics, the population of England was around 5.25 million in 1650, but dropped to about 4.9 million in 1680, largely due to the plague and other diseases like smallpox. Urban centers, of course, notably more afflicted by the plague, relied heavily on continuous immigration from smaller towns and rural areas to replenish the populations. By 1667, London's population showed signs of recovery, with burial rates returning to pre-plague levels, and hearth tax returns indicating restored household numbers. John Graunt's analysis of baptism records further suggested a population rebound. This recovery was mirrored in cities like Colchester, which, despite suffering severe depopulation, saw its cloth manufacturing and overall population nearly return to normal by 1674. However, not all towns fared as well. Ipswich, for example, experienced a population decline of 18% by 1674, which, in all fairness, could not solely be attributed to plague deaths. But, well, the plague certainly doesn't help attract any newcomers, doesn't it? Well, overall, the impact of the plague was significant but varied. While London recorded the highest death toll in a century, the proportion of deaths relative to the population was actually a lot less severe, at least compared to earlier epidemics in 1563, 1603, and 1625. Overall, approximately 2.5% of English population perished due to the plague during this period, which is, of course, not very good. The Great Fire of London, a devastating incident that transformed the city's topography, ignited on September the 2nd, 1666, and persisting for 4 grueling days until it was finally extinguished on September the 6th. The conflagration originated in a bakery on Pudding Lane, adjacent to London Bridge, and rapidly disseminated, exacerbated by vigorous winds and the city's largely timber structures. Notwithstanding the devastation of more than 13,000 homes, 87 parish churches, St. Paul's Cathedral, and the majority of municipal edifices, it astonishingly yielded a minimal number of fatalities, at least those documented. But the consequences of the fire resulted in a substantial urban transformation in London. King Charles II designated commissioners to revamp the city, resulting in the establishment of new construction regulations and the adoption of brick and stone in place of timber. The Reconstruction period resulted in the establishment of the contemporary London street plan and the architectural contributions of prominent figures such as Christopher Wren, who oversaw the renovation of St. Paul's Cathedral and various other churches. Thus, the Great Fire of London is a crucial event in the history of the city, showing again urban fragility, but also resilience, and significantly impacting urban planning and fire safety legislation from those days on. Welcome to the channel, everybody. For those new, good to meet you, and those coming back, good to have you again. We have a rather hot one today. It's a hot topic, I suppose you could say. Now, all jokes aside, I do appreciate those who like, subscribe, and leave a nice little comment. And not just me, the algorithm also appreciates it too. So, if you want others to share in the joy of this wonderful community we've created, well, just click a few buttons and you're contributing more than you would imagine. Now, with that all being said, it's time for us to begin. And of course, we begin all the way back in the 1660s, where London was quite a different place. But it had one thing in common with the modern-day London, that being that it was Britain's largest city. Well, how large was that? Well, it had a population ranging from 300 to 400,000 at the top end of it, and that ranks it as the third largest in the Western world. Of course, you have Paris too, and the other one escapes me, but still pretty big. So in 1659, there was one John Evelyn who described London as a wooden, northern, and inartificial congestion of houses. Somewhat of a foreshadowing. Of course, this is a stark contrast to the orderly Baroque grandeur of Paris. Now, by inartificial, Evelyn essentially meant that the city had grown organically, without much planning or even any regulations. You'd find a place to build your house and, well, you'd simply build your house, sometimes on top of somebody else's house. Well, in layman's terms, it was a bit of a mess. It was essentially turning into this chaotic urban sprawl. Originally, London was actually a Roman settlement. It goes back that far, and it even had the old city walls, and within these walls was where most people wanted to build their houses. You must remember 1659 was still sort of on the tail end of siege warfare. Still being inside the wall gives you this kind of sense of safety. Now, it also spread beyond the walls too, into these external districts like Cripplegate, Clerkenwell, Southwark, Shoreditch, and the Inns of Court, stretching westward along the Strand to Westminster's Royal Palace and Abbey. So, by the late 17th century, this grand old city of London, defined by the area enclosed by the city wall and the River Thames, represented just a fraction of London's overall size. Remember, we make this distinction between the urban populations and metropolitan populations. Now, the area had covered about 700 acres and roughly had about 80,000 residents. This is within inside the actual city walls, which accounts for about a quarter of the total population. The city was surrounded by a ring of inner suburbs, where most Londoners lived, but the city itself remained the commercial heart, housing England's largest market, and along with that, of course, England's busiest port, dominating trade and industry. However, that comes with problems. It was also extremely congested, even more dirty, and hand in hand with congestion and filth goes unhealth. You can see where we're having some problems here. Of course, this was especially following the outbreak of the bubonic plague in 1655, which devastated the population. You probably heard of the Great Plague of London. Well, I did do a video on it a while back if you're interested in that, but for now, we'll only talk about it in context to the Great Fire. Of course, it wasn't always happy times in London. Apart from the filth and the congestion and the dying of horrible diseases, there was also the tensions between the city and the crown, and they were as common as the filth. Perhaps they go hand in hand too, not to get political. Well, of course, London had been a stronghold of Republican sentiment during the English Civil War, and that's in living memory since that lasted 1642 to 51, in those chaotic days of Charles I, who they actually beheaded. Not the usual end for a king, especially in those days. Certainly put the rest of the aristocracy on high alert. Now, the city's wealth and power allowed it to challenge the authority of Charles II, as shown by multiple Republican uprisings in the early 1660s. The city magistrates, whom many of them had lived through the Civil War, were determined to avoid another attempt at absolute monarchy, which they believed had caused all the turmoil under Charles I. So when the Great Fire had threatened the city, they simply refused Charles II's offers of help, including all of his soldiers and all of his resources, as they were weary of bringing these royal forces into the city. By the time Charles took charge from the ineffective Lord Mayor, the fire was already completely out of control. Now, it didn't help as well that the City of London at this time had what was essentially a medieval street layout. We're talking a dense, narrow network of these winding, dirty cobblestone alleys. Before the Great Fire of 1666, London had already experienced a few other large fires, with the most recent occurring in 1633. Despite long-standing laws banning the use of wooden structures and thatched roofs, these cheaper materials, well, they were all most people could afford, and thus they remained common. Well, what were they going to do? Start tearing down people's homes? But think about it. A wooden structure with a thatched roof, it pretty much is in a great resemblance to a matchstick. Line enough of them up, and you have a big problem waiting to happen. Of course, not all of London was poor. You had the wealthier parts of the city, where merchants and brokers lived in large homes, but these were the only areas that were predominantly built with brick or stone, because they were the only ones who could afford it. Surrounding this affluent centre were overcrowded and poor parishes, where every available space was used to accommodate the rapidly growing population, which seemed to never stop growing. Of course, the houses in these areas were tightly packed and built in ways that increased the risk of fire. The typical multi-story houses had these jetties, as they were called, upper floors that extended over the street. No doubt if you've seen depictions of those medieval houses, you know what I'm talking about. Although these homes had small ground-level footprints, the overhanging upper stories created dangerous conditions that nearly touched over the narrow streets, making fires more likely and harder to contain. You see, if you have this street that's wide enough, especially a cobblestone one, it acts as a kind of fire break. Of course, well, when the street is narrow enough for fire to leap over, that doesn't really do much for you. And when the second level, or the third level, is closer and almost touching the building across the street, well, yeah, it's very easy for the fire to cross over. Now, in 1661, Charles II tried to address this by banning overhanging windows and jetties, but it was pretty much ignored. In 1665, he issued another warning about the fire risks posed by narrow streets, and he gave permission to arrest builders who violated the fire codes, or simply to just remove dangerous structures. Do you think anyone listened to him? Of course they didn't. This too had very little impact, if any impact at all. And by anyone's estimation, no one really cared about what the king had to say about it, especially when the poor were just trying to get by in whatever house they could. Situation was already miserable enough as it was. No one was going to allow someone to come rip their home down, regardless of how comely it was. Of course, the riverfront as well played another role in both the spread of the fire and the attempts to fight it. You see, the Thames offered a source of water and an escape route by boat, but the densely populated riverside areas were filled with warehouses and cellars, and of course, they were storing highly flammable materials, which increased the danger even more. And along the wharves, rickety timber tenements and tar paper shacks were crowded among the aging buildings, storing substances like pitch, rosin, tar, and hemp, and piles upon piles of flax. Large amounts of gunpowder were also stockpiled in the city, particularly along the river, where ship chandlers kept barrels of powder for trade. Much of it was left over from the English Civil War, with between about 500 and 600 tons stored in the Tower of London alone. Then, of course, there's the imposing Roman wall around the city, which, in contrast to keeping people safe, actually obstructed escape from the fire, limiting people to 8 narrow entrances. Of course, then you've got the problems with overcrowding and stampedes, people being trampled to death. Not a good situation. Now, in the initial days, few if anybody contemplated evacuating the engulfed city entirely. They would transport their possessions to a more secure location, or others just relocated their goods and themselves 4 or 5 times during a single day. The realization of the necessity to escape the confines emerged only late on Monday, resulting in near panic at the gates and distressed refugees attempting to flee with their belongings, carts, horses, and wagons. The primary obstacle hindering the early firefighting efforts was the constricted width of the streets. Of course, nothing was built to code. Now, in typical conditions, the combination of carts, wagons, and pedestrians in narrow passageways frequently resulted in gridlock and accidents. Refugees fleeing from the epicenter of devastation were obstructed by soldiers attempting to maintain clear roadways for firefighters, which of course exacerbated the fear even more. Now, fires were prevalent in the densely populated wooden city, characterized by fireplaces and candles, ovens, and warehouses full of flammable materials. Now, there was 1,000 watchmen, also called bellmen, that patrolled the streets at night, monitoring for fires as part of their responsibilities, and this had been set up for quite some time. There were also autonomous community protocols established for fire management, and generally they were effective. There were these publicly spirited citizens who would be notified of a perilous house fire by muted tolls of the church bells and would swiftly assemble to combat the blaze. Volunteers. Now that goes back a long time. Now, firefighting during the Great Fire of London relied heavily on demolition and the use of water. Each parish church was required to keep firefighting tools such as long ladders, leather buckets, axes, and fire hooks for tearing down buildings. Now, in some cases, controlled explosives were used to demolish structures quickly and create fire breaks. These drastic measures were crucial in stopping the fire, and along with the wind eventually dying down, played a key role in controlling the blaze. Didn't control it completely, but they did their best. Of course, the usual method of containing fires was to demolish buildings that were downwind, either with the fire hooks or the explosives. However, the Great Fire was a little different. This approach was delayed for hours due to the Lord Mayor's failure to act promptly. Yes, the blame is pretty much on him. Now, efforts to extinguish the fire with water were also hindered. You see, water was supplied through a network of elm pipes, serving around 30,000 homes from a high tower in Cornhill, refilled by the river at high tide, and by a reservoir in Islington. Firefighters could often tap into these pipes near a fire to fill buckets or hoses. You see, the fire had started close to the river, where ideally, in the best of situations, firefighters should have formed lines to carry buckets of water from the Thames to the fire. But guess what? It didn't happen, because everybody was too busy panicking and fleeing. Of course, the flames eventually reached the riverbank, damaging water wheels beneath London Bridge and completely cutting off the water supply. Though London had some advanced firefighting technology, at least for the time, we're talking like fire engines, things like this, there weren't really much use during the Great Fire. You see, the engines, large pumps designed to deliver water to the fire, were mostly mounted on sleds without wheels, and that made them difficult to move quickly. There were a few engines that were wheeled, but many of them just arrived too late, or they couldn't get close enough to the fire due to the intense heat. Firefighters tried to fill the engines' tanks by bringing them to the river, but several of them actually fell into the Thames, and, well, others just couldn't get close enough to make a difference. So, that's the gear that they had, the situation they're dealing with. But let's rewind it back a little bit, just so we can get a bit more of a story. Now, it all started at the bakery in Pudding Lane, more specifically, Thomas Farriner's bakery, just after midnight on Sunday, September the 2nd. Now, the family of the Farriners was confined upstairs, but they successfully went down from an upper window to the adjacent house, with the exception of a maidservant, who was reportedly too terrified to attempt to escape. And so, just like that, the Great Fire of London took its first victim, the poor frightened maid, screaming and burning. Rest in peace to her. Now the neighbors, of course, they had a rude awakening. They attempted to extinguish the fire, which was brave. After an hour, however, the parish constables arrived and deemed that the adjacent houses should be removed to avoid further spread. Of course, the residents were not pleased at this news, prompting the summons of Lord Mayor Sir Thomas Bloodworth for his authorization. Well, eventually Bloodworth did arrive, and by the time he did, the flames were engulfing the neighboring houses and advanced upwards towards the warehouses and combustible materials along the river. The more seasoned firefighters said that demolition was really the only way. However, Bloodworth, in all his expert opinion on firefighting, tended to disagree, citing the difficulty in locating the owners of the predominantly rental properties. Of course, Bloodworth, I'm sure you'll find, is the villain of the story. He's widely regarded as having been appointed to the position of Lord Mayor because of his compliance, rather than his qualifications for the role. And you're about to find out how qualified he really is. Well, he experienced stress during an unexpected emergency, and when confronted, uttered the frequently cited phrase that a woman might urinate the fire out. And then he just left. Well, on to a more well-known name. We have Samuel Pepys. And so, Samuel Pepys entered the Tower of London on Sunday morning to observe the fire from the battlements. It would have been the best view in town of the worst day in town. Now, he documented in his diary that the eastern gale, as in the gale force winds, had transformed what was a small blaze into an outright conflagration. It had incinerated around 300 residences and extended to the riverside. The residences on London Bridge were even ablaze. That's right, they used to have houses all over London Bridge, shops, all the rest. Pretty common. Now, he boarded a vessel to closely examine the devastation surrounding Pudding Lane and characterized the fire as lamentable, noting that everyone was striving to salvage their possessions, either casting them into the river or transferring them to lighters anchored nearby. The unfortunate individuals remained in their homes until the flames encroached upon them, subsequently fleeing to boats or scrambling from one set of stairs by the water's edge to another. Pepys proceeded westward along the river to the court at Whitehall, where many gathered around him, and he provided them with an account that frightened everybody there. And thus the information was quickly conveyed to the king. He informed the king and duke about his observations and stated that unless the king ordered the immediate demolition of the buildings, then the fire could simply not be contained. Of course, they appeared a little bit distressed about this, but the king instructed him to convey to the Lord Mayor his command to demolish all the structures in the path of the fire, and that was without exception. Now, the fire rapidly propagated in the strong winds, and by mid-morning on Sunday, individuals ceased efforts to extinguish their homes and began to evacuate. The throng of people, along with their bundles and carts, rendered the pathways inaccessible to firefighters and carriages. Pepys himself utilized a coach to return to the city from Whitehall, but disembarked at St. Paul's Cathedral, necessitating a walk thereafter. Pedestrians burdened with hand carts and merchandise were still evacuating from the fire. They entrusted their treasures to parish churches, distant from the immediate risk. By Sunday afternoon, the fire had escalated into a ferocious conflagration that generated its own meteorological conditions. A significant upward movement of heated air above the flames was propelled by the chimney effect in areas where the air current was confined, such as the narrow space between the jettied buildings, resulting in a vacuum at ground level. The resultant intense inward breezes exacerbated the flames. Think about it like bellows in a fire. And then the fire advanced towards the city center in a wide, arciform trajectory. And by the evening it had become the most destructive fire to impact London in living memory, having advanced 500 meters west along the Thames River. Well, by Monday, it wasn't much better. The fire propagated to the west and the north. The advance to the south was largely impeded by the river, however. It had incinerated the residences of London Bridge and posed a threat of crossing the bridge to jeopardize the borough of Southwark on the southern bank of the river. London Bridge, that sole physical link between the city and the southern bank of the River Thames, was identified as a perilous site during the fire of 1633, but nothing was done. Seems to be the prevailing theme, doesn't it? Nevertheless, Southwark was safeguarded by an open area between structures on the bridge that functioned as a fire break. Lucky for them. Well, what about the northern spread? Well, that touched the financial core of the city, the central business district, if you will. The residence of bankers on Lombard Street ignited on Monday afternoon, inciting a frantic effort to salvage their piles of gold coins before they liquefied. Oh, well, if anyone's going to lose their houses, I suppose the bankers can lose it. We're not a fan of bankers on this channel. Now, numerous observers highlight the despair and helplessness that appeared to engulf Londoners on this second day, alongside the absence of initiatives to protect the affluent, fashionable areas which were now threatened by the flames, including even the Royal Exchange, both a stock exchange and shopping hub, and the luxurious retail establishments in Cheapside. The Royal Exchange ignited in the late afternoon and became a smoking shell within a few hours. Now we have an account from John Evelyn, who was a diarist and courtier, and he wrote, and I quote from his words, "The conflagration was so universal, and the people so astonished, that from the beginning I know not by what despondency or fate they hardly stirred to quench it, so that there was nothing heard or seen but crying out and lamentation, running about like distracted creatures, without at all attempting to save even their goods. Such a strange consternation there was upon them." Evelyn resided at Deptford, 4 miles from the city, and so did not see the initial phase of the catastrophe. Now on Monday he travelled by coach to Southwark, accompanied by numerous other members of the upper class, to observe the view of the blazing city across the river that Samuel Pepys had witnessed in the previous day. Now the inferno had significantly intensified, and he said the entire city was engulfed in terrifying flames near the waterfront. All the structures from the bridge throughout Thames Street and extending towards Cheapside, down to the 3 cranes, were now obliterated. In the evening, Evelyn observed that the river was congested with barges and boats laden with merchandise attempting to flee. he witnessed a significant evacuation of carts and pedestrians through the constricted city gates, heading towards the vast fields to the north and east, which for many miles were scattered with various belongings and tents erected to shelter both individuals and any goods they could salvage. A wretched, disastrous scene. Suspicion quickly emerged in the endangered city that the fire was actually intentional. I wonder who they're going to blame that on. Well, the tumultuous winds transported embers and ignited particles over considerable distances, embedding them in thatched roofs and wooden gutters, which resulted in seemingly disconnected house fires erupting far from their origin. Well, that, of course, fueled speculation that new fires were being deliberately lit. Well, of course, the first go-to for blaming is the foreigners. They were promptly regarded with suspicion due to the ongoing Anglo-Dutch War. And so, on Monday, fear and suspicion solidified into conviction as tales emerged of an impending invasion and sightings of foreign covert operatives allegedly launching fireballs into residences, or apprehended with hand grenades or matches. Of course, this prompted a surge of urban violence. Of course, the apprehensions regarding terrorism were exacerbated by the breakdown of communications and the dissemination of news. The General Letter Office on Threadneedle Street, a postal hub for the entire nation, was consumed by fire early on Monday morning. Well, there goes the media. What are we going to do without them? Well, the London Gazette successfully published its Monday issue prior to the printing facility catching fire. All that paper would have went pretty quickly, I'm sure. Well, on Monday, suspicions escalated into panic and the communal hysteria, prompting the trained bands and the Coldstream Guards to prioritize the apprehension of foreigners and individuals deemed suspect over firefighting, resulting in arrests and interventions to protect them from mobs. Now, the residents, particularly the elites and upper class, were increasingly anxious to evacuate their possessions from the city. This generated revenue for these able-bodied impoverished, who engaged as porters, sometimes just absconding with the merchandise themselves, proving particularly lucrative for the proprietors of carts and boats. Make hay while the sun shines, I suppose. Well, renting a cart had cost about a few pounds a week prior to the fire. But on Monday, that price had gone all the way up to £40. It doesn't sound like too much, but that is a sum equivalent to about £130,000 in 2021. And you're probably talking about the same in US dollars. I think the conversion is around the same. Now, almost every single cart and boat owner in the vicinity of London participated in this, with carts colliding at small gates as the frantic residents attempted to escape. The tumult at the gates prompted the magistrates to temporarily close them, aiming to redirect the citizens' focus from protecting their belongings to actually helping to combat the blaze. That, with no exception of salvaging any items, they might fervently strive to save their homes. Now, Monday signified the commencement of coordinated efforts, despite the disintegration of order in the streets, particularly at the entrances as the fires uncontrollably blazed. Bloodworth, the unpopular Lord Mayor, was tasked with supervising the firefighting efforts. However, no one could find where he was. He had seemingly vacated the city, as his name is absent from any contemporary chronicles of the events on Monday. During the state of emergency, the king appointed his brother, James, the Duke of York, to oversee activities. James established command posts throughout the fire's perimeter. 3 courtiers were appointed to oversee each position, with direct authorization from Charles to mandate demolitions. James and his bodyguards patrolled the streets throughout Monday, rescuing foreigners from the mob and striving to maintain order. Well, on Monday evening, expectations were thwarted as the substantial stone walls of Baynard's castle in Blackfriars failed to contain the flames. Serving as the western equivalent of the Tower of London, this historic royal residence was entirely engulfed and raged in flame throughout the night. Tuesday, the 4th of September, was the peak of the devastation. Not a nice thing to wake up to at all. The Duke of York's command post at Temple Bar, where Strand intersects Fleet Street, was intended to halt the fire's progression westward towards the Palace of Whitehall. He anticipated that the River Fleet would create a natural fire break, positioning his firefighters from Fleet Bridge to the Thames. On Tuesday morning, the plan did not go as they wanted. The flames surged over the fleet and encircled them, propelled by the relentless easterly gale, compelling them all to flee. By mid-morning, the fire had penetrated the expansive, opulent shopping avenue of Cheapside. James's crew established an extensive fire break to the north of the blaze. However, it was compromised at several locations. Throughout the day, the flames advanced eastward from the vicinity of Pudding Lane, directly opposing the prevailing east wind and heading towards the Tower of London. And if you remember, that was full of 500 to 600 tons of gunpowder. You can see how this is going to be a problem. Now, the garrison in the tower acted independently after awaiting assistance from James's official firefighters, who were occupied in the west throughout the day, and they established their own fire breaks by detonating houses extensively in the surrounding area. And lucky for them, the fire was stopped before it got to the tower. Well, all believed that St. Paul's Cathedral was a secure sanctuary. And of course it was. Robust stone walls, a large vacant plaza encircling it, a natural fire break. Now the space was densely filled with salvaged items, and its crypt contained the tightly packed inventories of the printers and bookshelves from the adjacent Paternoster Row. The structure was enveloped in wooden scaffolding, undergoing incremental restoration by Christopher Wren. The scaffolding ignited on Tuesday evening, and within 30 minutes, the lead ceiling had begun to melt, and eventually, the books and papers in the vault ignited. The cathedral rapidly deteriorated into a smoldering ruin. On Tuesday evening, somewhat of a reprieve. The wind subsided, and the fire breaks established by the garrison commenced to show some efficacy. On Wednesday, the 5th of September, Pepys ascended to the steeple of Barking Church, from whence he beheld the ravaged city, and I quote, "the most lamentable spectacle of desolation that I have ever witnessed. Numerous isolated fires continued to blaze, although the Great Fire had essentially concluded. It required considerable effort to extinguish the final remnants, and coal continued to smolder in cellars more than 2 months later. Only a limited number of fatalities were recorded, and it is conventionally assumed that the casualties were minimal. Porter cites the amount as 8, while Tinniswood states in single figures, noting that some fatalities may have gone undetected. Additionally, he mentions that refugees also succumbed in the makeshift camps, apart from direct deaths caused by fire and smoke inhalation, which is, by the way, how most people die in fires: asphyxiation. Now you think about it, all that smoke. It's only so long that you can breathe that in without passing out. And usually the smoke gets you before the fire does. Maybe that's a better way to go. Now, the material devastation has been quantified at 13,500 residences, 87 parish churches, 44 company halls, the Royal Exchange, the Customs House, St. Paul's Cathedral, Bridewell Palace and other city prisons, the General Letter Office, and 3 western city gates, Ludgate, Newgate, and Aldersgate. In terms of financial loss, we're talking between 9 to 10 million pounds, which in today's money is about 2.1 billion. So, what happened next? Of course, they didn't just abandon London. That would be silly. Reconstruction efforts, and radical ones at that, were submitted for the devastated city and endorsed by Charles. In addition to Wren and Evelyn, it is acknowledged that Robert Hooke, Valentine Knight, and Richard Newcourt offered proposals for reconstruction. Now all of them were founded on a grid pattern, which became widespread in the American metropolitan environment. Now, if it had been reconstructed according to certain ideas, London may have competed with Paris in Baroque splendor. Now, archaeologist John Schofield asserts that Wren's scheme would have likely facilitated the segregation of social classes into distinct areas, akin to Haussmann's reconstruction of Paris in the mid-1800s. But if you ask me, that's a bit of a misnomer. A social class is not already segregated. The rich people live in the rich area, the poor people in the poor area. Well, either way, Wren's concept was especially difficult to execute due to the necessity of redefining property titles. Too much paperwork, and no one likes paperwork. So the Crown and municipal authorities endeavored to negotiate compensation for the extensive remodeling necessitated by these plans. But that impractical notion had to be relinquished. Calls to recruit labourers and assess the land where the houses once stood were largely disregarded by individuals preoccupied just with daily survival, as well, of course, by those who had departed the capital. Additionally, there was a labour shortage resulting from the fire, which rendered it unfeasible to obtain workers for the arduous task. The majority of the original street layout was replicated in the new city, at least for the most part. Now, it's been suggested that this procedure expedited the advancement of scientific survey and cartographic methodology. basically encompassing the creation of these iconographical city maps. The renovation resulted in enhancements in cleanliness, of course, and fire safety, talking broader streets, open and accessible wharfs along the Thames, free from blocking dwellings, and, crucially, most important, structures that were built of brick and stone rather than wood. So, this all got put into a new law called the Reconstruction of London Act 1666, and it prohibited the use of wood for building exteriors, limited the prices of construction materials and labor, and established a 3-year reconstruction period after which the land might be sold. A tax was also levied on coal to finance the municipal reconstruction expenses. The majority of private reconstruction was finalized by 1671. New public edifices were constructed on the grounds of their predecessors, including St. Paul's Cathedral and Christopher Wren's 51 new churches. So, the Great Fire not only altered the city's physical landscape, but its demographic, political, social, and economic. Well, the fire resulted in the most significant disruption in London's residential architecture in its history. It wouldn't be surpassed until the Blitz of the Second World War. The regions of West London experienced the greatest influx of new people, where there was an overall rise in population density in the suburbs encircling London. Approximately 9,000 new residences were constructed in a region where over 13,000 had been obliterated, and by 1674, thousands of them were uninhabited. Tenants that remained in London experienced a substantial reduction in their lease expenses. But of course, it also impeded commercial operations, resulting in destruction of buildings and inventory, while the victims incurred substantial debts and reconstruction expenses. Consequently, the economic recovery was sluggish. The City of London Corporation incurred substantial debts to finance its reconstruction, defaulting on its loans in 1683. Thus, it had its privileges revoked by Charles. The commercial district of London had substantial vacancies as merchants relocated to other areas. Charitable foundations incurred substantial financial losses too, due to direct fire-related expenses and the forfeiture of rental income. Either way, notwithstanding these circumstances, London maintained its economic preeminence due to its access to maritime routes and ongoing centrality in England's political and cultural spheres. Undefeated. Well, there will be plenty more bad luck for London in the future. Now, if you go to London today, you can go to where the fire started. At the request of Charles II, a monument to the Great Fire of London was erected right at the spot on Pudding Lane, designed by no less than Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke themselves. It's 61 meters tall. That's about 200 feet, so you can't miss it. In 1681, an inscription which included the accusation towards the Catholics of causing the fire was added, but that was removed in 1830 following a campaign led by city solicitor Charles Pearson after the Roman Catholic Relief Act of 1829. Another monument, the Golden Boy of Pye Corner in Smithfield, marks where the fire is said to have ended. In the summer of 1858, The city of London was engulfed by a catastrophic environmental crisis, known as the Great Stink. The city was suffocated by an overwhelming odor emanating from the River Thames, where mountains of untreated human waste and industrial runoff had accumulated. An exceptionally hot summer exacerbated the situation, accelerating the fermentation of sewage and the intensifying of the stench to levels unbearable. The noxious miasma was so severe that it disrupted the daily operations of key institutions, including the House of Commons and even the law courts, forcing the British government to confront an issue that could no longer be ignored. The dire circumstances of the Great Stink catalyzed urgent action to overhaul London's archaic and insufficient sewage system. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, a then prominent engineer, who was commissioned to design and implement a comprehensive solution. His pioneering project involved the construction of an extensive network of sewers that effectively redirected the city's waste downstream, far away from the urban center. This monumental engineering feat not only resolved the immediate crisis, but it set new standards for urban sanitation across the world. It significantly improved public health conditions in London, virtually eliminating the frequent cholera outbreaks and other waterborne diseases that had long plagued the city. And so, the events of the Great Stink of 1858 marked a transformative period in the history of London, highlighting the critical importance of sustainable management of waste and leading to public health innovations that shaped modern metropolitan living. Welcome to the channel, everyone. Well, I hope you've already had your dinner, because, well, if you can tell by the introduction, it's going to be a rather smelly video. As always, I do appreciate a bit of spirited conversation in the comments, and a like on the video as well does wonders for the algorithm. You already know that. And so with that in mind, and the very easy click it takes to like and subscribe, let's begin and get nice and relaxed and go back to 1858, or perhaps a little bit earlier, to trace the roots of the Great Stink of London. And so the roots that we begin to trace go back to the 17th century, where sections of the Fleet and Walbrook rivers were enclosed for the purpose of sewage management, which resulted in significant changes to London's sewer system, if a system it could be called. And so we fast forward a little bit to the year 1856, when more than 100 sewers had actually been built in the city of London. However, the problems remained. The city still had more than 200,000 cesspits and approximately 360 sewers, and many of these that they did have were in quite a poor condition. Imagine the smell. Methane and other hazardous gases frequently escaped from these cesspits, which resulted in explosions when they were released. Over the course of the 19th century, the situation only became more dire as the population increased from 1 to 3 million, and the practice of flushing toilets, quite new at the time, was becoming more and more widespread. Well, by the year 1858, where we find ourselves now, the city's outdated sewer system was so overwhelmed by the additional water and waste from the toilets, along with the factories, the slaughterhouses, and other industrial operations. A problem was definitely about to occur. You see, the city's old wooden water pipes had been replaced with iron ones by that year, which seemed to help a little bit, but once again, band-aid solutions. Now, in terms of the Thames River, well, that was further contaminated as a result of the majority of this waste that was dumped directly into it. Now, the condition of the river is actually described by the scientist Michael Faraday in a letter that he wrote to the Times in the year of 1855. Now, based on the results of an experiment that he conducted using white paper to determine the opacity of the Thames, he reported filth accumulated in such dense clouds that it was visible at the surface. No swimming. Thereby comparing the river to what is essentially, for lack of better terms, a giant sewer. Well, the following year, the authorities did make an effort to control the odor by adding chalk lime, chloride of lime, and carbolic acid to the water. But, as we always say once again, band-aid solutions. It didn't really help. It was still awful. Now, a significant portion of Victorian society was a proponent of this miasma theory, which is quite old. It basically proposed that diseases like cholera were brought on by foul-smelling air, particularly which was caused by decomposing organic matter or sewage. Now, you've probably all seen those plague doctors with the mask with the big beak. Now, they actually had a practical application, and it tied in with this miasma theory. You see, that beak was actually not such a stylistic choice, but rather a practical one. You would essentially stuff it full of sweet-smelling flowers and perfumes to combat the miasma, this bad smell. A lot of people believe that if you didn't smell it, it couldn't get you. Of course, this is long before the days of germ theory and all the rest, which people were kind of catching on to at the time, but still quite new. It takes a while for people to catch up. Now, concerns about the rapidly spreading cholera outbreaks that ravaged Europe in the 19th century were also fueled by this theory. Cholera, by the way, was a disease that was particularly feared, as, well, you didn't have much chance of surviving it. And if you did get it, there was a very good chance that everybody else around you would also get it. If the plague wasn't to be feared, cholera was definitely second on the list, perhaps arguable with typhoid, tuberculosis, these sorts of things. Now, there were 6,500 or so people who actually lost their lives as the result of the first significant cholera pandemic that occurred in London earlier in the year 1831. And there was an additional outbreak that occurred in the years between 1848 and 49, which was even worse. In fact, almost 3 times as many people died in that one, just over 14,000. This was followed by an additional outbreak in the years 1853 to 54, which resulted in the deaths of a further 10,000 people. Now, there was a physician in London, Dr. John Snow, who made the observation that the mortality rates were higher in areas that were served by the Lambeth, Southwark, and Vauxhall water companies during the second outbreak. And thus, in 1849, he published a paper with the title On the Mode of Communication of Cholera, in which he proposed the hypothesis of waterborne transmission, as an alternative to the miasma theory. Like I said, people are catching on, but kind of slowly. However, Unfortunately for him and all of the people not wanting to die of cholera, the work received very little attention. Now, 6 years later, 1854, following the third cholera outbreak, he published an updated version of the treatise, focusing on the effects that the disease had on Broad Street in the Soho neighborhood. And at that time, a rather interesting event happened that somewhat helped him in pushing his theory out. You see, as a result of heavy snowfall and things icing up, seizing all the rest, there was a local water pump of which the handle had become detached, which prevented access to the contaminated water and resulted in a reduction in the number of fatalities. Now, obviously, they investigated this, and upon investigation it was found that a leaking sewer was located in close proximity to the well from which the water was actually extracted. So the only difference between this well and that well was that one of them had this contaminated water in it and was not actually pure. Definitely raises a few eyebrows. Brush your teeth. Now, during the 19th century, the civic infrastructure that was responsible for managing London's sewers went through a number of different changes. There was one social reformer by the name of Edwin Chadwick, and a royal commission along with it were set up to establish and come up with an idea to the Metropolitan Commission of Sewers in the year 1848, also abbreviated to the MCS if we talk about this later on. Now, it was the first time that a single authority had the power to exercise full responsibility over the sanitation infrastructure of a capital city. Now, the MCS was responsible for replacing 7 of the 8 authorities that had been in charge of London's sewers, dating all the way back to the time of Henry VIII. As a result of the Building Act of 1844, which mandated that all new constructions must be connected to a sewer system rather than a cesspool, the Commission was compelled to either connect cesspools to sewers or simply to just get rid of them altogether. Now, a program of frequent flushing of the sewers was implemented by Chadwick and his successor, pathologist John Simon, in response to concerns that miasma from the sewers could facilitate the transmission of disease. This program resulted in an increase in the amount of sewage that was discharged into the Thames. And you see, there's the problem. Always taking it away to some other area. Somebody else's problem. Until, of course, the Thames dries up and it all comes back with a vengeance. Now, the comprehensive plans that Bazalgette had been working on were completed by June of 1856. Remember, he was that civil engineer. Now, these plans included the installation of small, local sewers with a diameter of approximately 3 feet, which is just shy of 1 meter, that would connect to a network of larger sewers and ultimately discharge into the main outflow pipes that measured 11 feet or about 3.5 meters in height. Pretty formidable. Now, the 2 outfall sewers were designed to handle waste management. One of these sewers was designated for the northern side of the river, and the other developed for the southern side of the river. The City of London was divided into 3 distinct zones: high, middle, and low level. Each of these zones was served by a primary sewer, and a network of pumping stations was established to transport waste away from the city and towards the east. The plan that Bazalgette proposed was based on Foster's design. However, it was more expansive and could accommodate a greater increase in population, which went from 3 million to 4.5 million. Thinking ahead, always. Now, the first Commissioner of Works, being Sir Benjamin Hall, was the recipient of Basilgate's presentation of his proposals. Concerns were voiced by Hall regarding the outfalls, which are the points at which waste is discharged from the sewers that are situated within the capital, and he deemed these outfalls to be unacceptable. Throughout the course of the ongoing conversations, Basilgate made adjustments and modifications to his plans in order to conform to Hall's requirements. The plans were presented by Hall to 3 consulting engineers in the December of 1856. Now, these engineers were Captain Douglas Strutt Galton of the Royal Engineers, James Simpson, who was an engineer with 2 water companies, and James Blackwood, who was the chief engineer of Kennet and Avon Canal. So the 3 individuals presented their suggestions for alterations to the outfall positions to Hall in the July of 1857. Hall then took it upon himself to forward these suggestions to the MBW in October of that same year. Now, these plans were estimated to cost more than £5.4 million, which, by the way, was significantly higher than the maximum estimate of Basilgate's plan, which was £2.4 million. The newly proposed discharge points were to consist of open sewers that extended 15 miles beyond the locations that were suggested by the board. During the general election that took place in February of 1858, Lord Palmerston, the best British Prime Minister, his Whig government was actually overthrown, and it was succeeded by Lord Derby's second Conservative administration. Lord John Manners succeeded Lord Hall, and Benjamin Disraeli was appointed as both the leader of the House of Commons and Chancellor of the Exchequer. And so we finally arrive to the day of the stinkiness. By mid-1858, issues concerning the Thames had been accumulating for several years. Now, in his novel, Little Dorrit, which was serialized from 1855 to 57, Charles Dickens had actually described the Thames River as, I quote, a deadly sewer in the place of a fine, fresh river. Now, that's a 1-star review from Dickens, that's for sure. Well, in correspondence with a friend, Dickens also remarked, I can attest that the noxious odors, even in that brief inhalation, have been most distending nature for the head and the stomach. While the social scientist and journalist George Godwin had also noted that, I quote, in certain areas the accumulation exceeds 6 feet in depth on the Thames foreshore, and that the entirety is densely saturated with contaminated substances. In June of 1858, the shaded temperatures in London had averaged between 34 and 36 degrees Celsius, which is about 93, 97 Fahrenheit, and had even escalated to 48 degrees in direct sunlight, and that's at almost 120 Fahrenheit. Now, the prolonged dry weather resulted in a decrease in the Thames water level, causing the untreated sewage to wash up and accumulate along the river banks. You can only imagine it. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert endeavoured to embark on a leisure cruise on the Thames, but they returned to the shore shortly after, due to the smell being so unbearable. So the media got to work quite quickly, promptly dubbing the incident the Great Stink. The principal article in the city press remarked, I quote, "The refinement of language has ceased. It reeks, and anyone who breathes in the odor can never forget it and should consider themselves fortunate if they survive to recall it." An author for the Standard agrees with the viewpoint. One reporter characterized the river as a pestiferous and typhus-breeding abomination. That's a good one. While another noticed that the quantity of poisonous gases emitted is commensurate with the rise in sewage discharged into the stream. The principal article for the Illustrated London News remarked that we can colonize the remotest ends of the earth. We can conquer India. We can pay the interest of the most enormous debt ever contracted. We can spread our name and our fame and our fructifying wealth to every part of the world. But we cannot clean the River Thames. By June, the odor emanating from the river had intensified to such an extent that parliamentary proceedings were disrupted. And you know it's bad when even the government have to get out of there. Well, prompting the curtains of the riverside building to be treated with lime chloride to kind of attempt to make this sort of barrier against the stench. Obviously, this was unsuccessful, prompting discussions regarding the potential relocation of governmental operations to either St. Albans or Oxford. Now, the Examiner reported that Benjamin Disraeli, upon entering a committee room, soon departed with the other committee members, holding a mass of papers in one hand and applying his pocket handkerchief to his nose due to the unpleasant odor. While the interruption of its legislative activities has prompted inquiries in the House of Commons. As recorded in Hansard, MP John Brady notified Manners that members were prohibited from utilizing the committee rooms or the library due to the foulness of the odor, and inquired whether the noble lord had implemented any measures to alleviate the effluvium and terminate the nuisance. Manners stated that the Thames fell outside of his jurisdiction. Typical politician, isn't it? Some things never change. Well, 4 days later, a second MP had remarked that through pervasive ingenuity, one of the most illustrious rivers has been transformed into a cesspool, and I wish to inquire whether Her Majesty's government has any plans to take measures to rectify the issue. Manners indicated that Her Majesty's government has no involvement with the condition of the Thames. Once again, typical politician. The satirical publication Punch remarked that the one absorbing topic in both houses of Parliament was the conspiracy to poison question. Of the guilt of that old offender, Father Thames, there was the most ample evidence. And so, right at the very peak of the disaster, 200 to 250 long tons of lime were utilized near the sewer outlets, discharging it into the Thames, with workers engaged in distributing lime on the Thames foreshore at low tide. What a job. And this expenditure amounted to around £1,500 weekly. Of course, they weren't actually cleaning anything up, they were just spraying the lime on top of it. It's not very practical. Well, on the 15th of June, Disraeli presented the Metropolis Local Management Amendment Bill, a proposed modification to the 1855 Act. During the initial debate, he referred to the Thames as a Stygian pool, reeking with ineffable and intolerant horrors. I love the descriptions, I really do. Well, the bill assigned the responsibility of cleaning the Thames to the MBW and stipulated that, as far as may be possible, sewage outlets should not be located within London's boundaries. It also permitted the board to borrow £3 million to be repaid through a 3-penny levy on all London households over the subsequent 40 years. The terms supported Basilgate's original 1856 plan and addressed Hall's objections to it. The principal article in the Times noted that Parliament was nearly obligated to enact legislation regarding the significant London nuisance due to the overwhelming order. And so, the bill was deliberated in late July and quickly enacted into law on the 2nd of August. Now, back to Basilgate, because he's somewhat the main character, I guess the hero in the story. His proposal for over 1,100 miles of supplementary street sewers designed to collect both effluent and rainwater, which would connect to 82 miles of primary connecting sewers, was tendered between 1859 and 65. 400 draftsmen collaborated on the comprehensive plans and sectional views for the initial phase of the construction process. Numerous engineering challenges needed to be addressed, of course, especially the reality that certain areas of London, including Pimlico and Lambeth, were actually situated below the high water mark, which could cause some issues. Now, Basilgate's strategy for the low-lying regions involved elevating sewage from low-lying sewers at critical junctures into the mid- and high-level sewers. Now, that would subsequently discharge by gravity anything in there towards the eastern outfalls at a gradient of 2 feet per mile. Now, Basilgate advocated for the utilization of Portland cement, a material that possessed greater strength than conventional cement, kind of a new thing at the time. But unfortunately, it is susceptible to degradation when subjected to excessive heat, which was exactly what they were getting. Now, to address that issue, he implemented a quality control system to evaluate batches of cement, characterized by some as both elaborate but also draconian. The results were communicated to the manufacturers, who modified their production process to enhance the product further, perfecting it, making little tweaks as they went along. Cement. It's a hard job. Well, a cement manufacturer remarked that the MBW was the inaugural public entity to implement such testing procedures. The advancement of Basilgate's projects was positively reported in the media too. Everyone was getting pretty excited about it. In fact, people were depicting him and the workers on it in kind of a heroic light. You can imagine people giving them a kind of a round of applause on their way to get rid of the horrible smell. In fact, I would even go so far to say that they probably saved more lives. Well, they definitely saved more lives than any of the doctors ever did in London. Think about that. Thank your local plumber. Well, of course, plumbing is expensive. So in July of 1863, an additional £1.2 million was loaned to the engineers to address the exorbitant construction costs. But pretty much at this point, I think you couldn't really put a price on it. People were willing to pay whatever it takes to sort out that issue. And so the southern system, traversing the sparsely populated suburbs of London, constituted the smaller and more manageable segment of the infrastructure to construct. 3 primary sewers extended from Putney, Wandsworth, and Norwood, converging in Deptford. A pumping station elevated the effluent 21 feet into the primary outflow sewer, which directed it to the Crossness pumping station on the Erith marshes, where it was released into the Thames at high tide. The recently constructed station at Crossness was designed by Bazalgette, in cooperation with consultant engineer Charles Driver, an advocate for the utilization of cast iron as a construction material. And eventually, they'd finished it all up. The pumping station was inaugurated in the month of April 1865 by the Prince of Wales. That was the future King Edward VII, by the way, who ceremoniously commenced the engines himself. The ceremony attended by various members of royalty too, MPs, the Lord Mayor of London, and the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, and they all managed to have a nice dinner afterwards, to the tune of 500 guests within the venue, which now, no doubt, smelled quite a bit more pleasant than it did before. Now the ceremony signified the conclusion of the southern outfall sewers construction and the commencement of their operation. Chalk this one to a win for the engineers. So, following the successful execution of the southern outflow, a board member of the MBW, MP Miller, proposed a bonus for Bazalgette, which is very nice of him, but that just goes to show you how impressed and happy everybody was with him. Like I said, a hero in the story. Now the board consented to compensate the engineer £6,000, which was 3 times his annual salary. But that wasn't enough. They also wanted an extra £4,000 to be distributed among his 3 assistants. Despite the idea being abandoned after criticism, it's noted that these substantial sums were considered during a period when frugality was the prevailing trait of public spending. It's a very strong indication of this significant public interest and endorsement that characterized the process of the work. So, the northern bank of the Thames was more populous compared to the south, accommodating 2/3 of London's inhabitants. This was going to be a much bigger job, necessitating the works to navigate through congested streets and surmount urban obstacles. We're talking bridges, canals, and of course the railway lines, which were also kind of a new thing, but there were plenty of them. So construction of the system commenced on the 31st of January 1859. However, the builders faced various challenges. One of them was actually a labour strike, which lasted from 1859 to 60. And also, this time, not the severe summer weather, but severe winter frosts and above average rainfall. Not pleasant conditions to work in by anyone's reckoning. And so in June of 1862, the torrential rain caused an accident at the construction site of the Fleet Sewer. The extensive excavations were conducted alongside the cutting excavation at Clerkenwell for the Metropolitan Railway, and the 8.5-foot wall separating the 2 trenches collapsed, releasing waters of the Fleet onto Victoria Street. They also managed to damage the gas and water mains. Now the elevated sewer, the northernmost, of the infrastructure extended from Hampstead Heath to Stoke Newington and traversed Victoria Park, where it connected with the eastern terminus of the mid-level sewer. The mid-level sewer originated in the west at Bayswater and traversed Oxford Street, passing through Clerkenwell and Bethnal Garden prior to the junction. The integrated main sewer directed flow to the Abbey Mills pumping station in Stratford, where it connected with the eastern segment of the low-level sewer. Well, as for the pumps at Abbey Mills, they elevated the effluent from low-level sewer by 36 feet into the main sewer. The primary sewer extended 5 miles along the current Greenway to the outfall at Beckton. Now, similar to the Crossness pumping station, Abbey Mills was a collaborative design by Bazalgette and Driver. Atop the centre to the engine house was an elaborate dome that some assert to be a superficial resemblance to a Byzantine church, which arguable, I suppose. Now, the architectural historian Nicholas Pevsner, in his Buildings of England book, remarked that the structure exhibited exciting architecture applied to the most nefarious purposes. There's something to be said for it, I suppose. He further characterizes it as an unorthodox amalgamation, vaguely Italian Gothic in style, yet featuring tiers of Byzantine windows and a central octagonal lantern that imparts a refined Russian essence. Well, in February of 1864, we're not travelling back in time, Bazalgette commenced the construction of the 3 embankments along the banks of the Thames to facilitate drainage for the low-level sewers. He constructed the Victoria Embankment on the northern side, extending from Westminster to Blackfriars Bridge, and the Chelsea Embankment, which stretches from Millbank to Cadogan Pier in Chelsea. The southern side features the Albert Embankment, extending from the Lambeth terminus of Westminster Bridge to Vauxhall. He constructed sewers adjacent to the Thames, erecting walls on the foreshore, installing sewer pipes within, and then backfilling around them. The project appropriated over 52 acres of land from the Thames. The Victoria Embankment additionally alleviated congestion on the existing thoroughfares between Westminster and the City of London. The estimated cost of constructing the embankments was £1.7 million, with about £450,000 allocated for acquiring the requisite riverfront properties, primarily designated for light industrial purposes. Now, the embankment project was regarded as nationally significant, and due to the Queen's illness, the Prince of Wales inaugurated the Victoria Embankment in July of 1870. The Albert Embankment was also completed in November of 1869, and the Chelsea Embankment inaugurated by July of 1874. Bazalgette regarded the embankment project as one of the most challenging and complex undertakings that the NBW had to execute. And shortly after the inauguration of the Chelsea Embankment, they actually knighted him. That's right, the sword down on both ears. Sir Bazalgette. Now, in 1875, the Western Drainage Project was finalized, and the system had become fully functional. The construction necessitated 318 million bricks and almost 900,000 cubic yards of concrete and mortar, culminating in a total expenditure at the end of the day of approximately £6.5 million. Well, moving on to 1866, A subsequent cholera outbreak in London resulted in almost 6,000 fatalities, though it was restricted to a region of the East End between Aldgate and Bow. Now here's the interesting thing. At that time, the region was not integrated into Basilisk's system, resulting in 93% of the fatalities occurring within that area. Now, as we all say, the proof is in the pudding, isn't it? Well, the responsibility rested with the East London Water Company, which released its sewage half a mile downstream from its reservoir. The incoming tide was transporting the sewage upriver into the reservoir, thereby contaminating the local drinking water. Not good. The emergence and identification of its causes resulted in the acknowledgement that cholera was actually waterborne, rather than spread by miasma. The Lancet reported that Dr. William Farr's investigation would substantiate his conclusions regarding the water supply's role in the epidemic's causation, and it was actually the final occurrence of the disease in the capital. That's right. After they fixed the sewers, they fixed the sickness. Now, of course, at least one of them, the waterborne diseases. There'll be plenty more diseases to come, don't worry. Now we go forward a little bit now to 1878. The Thames pleasure steamer SS Princess Alice collided with the collier Breuil Castle and sank, resulting in 650 deaths. The incident occurred near the Outfalls, prompting inquiries in the British media regarding the potential link between the sewage and several fatalities. Not a good place for a swim, that's for sure. Well, in the 1880s, escalating concerns regarding potential health risks associated with outfalls prompted the Metropolitan Board of Works to actually purify the sewage at Crossness and Beckton, instead of just straight out discharging untreated waste into the river. Once again, another advancement. Consequently, 6 so-called sludge boats, which is a very disgusting name for them, were commissioned to transport the goods for disposal in the North Sea. The inaugural vessel, commissioned in 1887, was designed and called the SS Bazalgette. The operation persisted until December of 1998. That's right, 1998, when the disposal of waste actually transitioned to incineration. I'm sure those up on the shores of the North Sea were quite happy with that development. Of course, the sewers again were enlarged in the late 19th century, and subsequently in the early 20th century. As of 2015, the drainage network is administered by Thames Water and serves up to 8 million individuals daily. The company stated in 2014 that the system is struggling to meet the demands of 21st century London. Which leaves us with the question, are we only around the corner from the next great stink? Heaven forbid that. Well, and with that, we reach the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed that one. A little bit of different kind of history, bit of engineering, bit of public safety, a bit of epidemiology. We can get a bit of everything, don't we? So I'm going to thank my top tier patrons and supporters: Dark, Kerry, Kimberly, Ben, Ember, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fizarbo, Legitmus, Maverick, and Susan. Thank you very much, and I hope you all enjoyed. We're going to have a nice little rest now, shall we? Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all, and I will see you in the next fine-smelling video. Good night.